Hi, this is Howard Tiersky, and welcome to another episode of our Digital Innovation Series. Today's topic is embracing the disgruntled customer. You know, if my assistant told me I have 2 appointments on my calendar for the afternoon, one with a customer who wanted to talk to me because he is so happy with the work we've done for their company, he wanted to tell me personally, and the other with a customer who is deeply dissatisfied and perhaps even thinking of leaving. Which meeting do you think I would be looking forward to? How would you feel about these 2 upcoming meetings? Well, if you're like most people, you're probably going to feel some sort of apprehension about meeting the unhappy customer. In general, I think most of us are in business, at least in part, to make people happy, to create satisfied customers. So every unsatisfied customer can seem like a failure, and it's not fun or enjoyable for most people to experience failure, especially in the form of a customer telling you off. In fact, psychology research has shown that the impact of praise and criticism are not equal. For most people, the same volume of criticism is felt much more deeply than praise, which means that for most people, when they go home after those 2 customer meetings, the positive one and the negative one, they're probably going to focus more on the feelings generated by the unhappy customer than the happy one. So if unhappy customers generally put us in a bad mood, why should we embrace them? Maybe we should just stay away from them. Life's too short to be bummed out, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out that disgruntled customers are an absolute goldmine of potential insights about your product or service and your overall business, if you mine them in the right way. First of all, let me encourage you to ask a really high-quality question that I learned from one of the smartest people I know, Tony Robbins. The question is, what's great about disgruntled customers? Those customers who are vocally unhappy about your product, service, or business. The ones who complain, even bitterly, via phone, letter, email, Twitter, message board, what have you. Take a second and ask yourself that question. What is really and truly great about these customers? Is that a tough question? Well, here are a few things that I have found to be great about them. First of all, they care. They care about your product. If they didn't, they wouldn't be emotional. They wouldn't be reaching out. Second of all, they're willing to give you their time, at least those who complain. They typically want to engage in some sort of dialogue, or again, they wouldn't be reaching out to you. Third, they chose you to begin with. They wouldn't be customers if they hadn't made a decision at some point to buy your product or service. Fourth, they have knowledge about your overall product experience, by which I mean your marketing, your sales process, what it is like to begin using your product. They have been through at least part, if not most, of your customer life cycle. And some aspects of it must have been good, or they wouldn't be customers, right? And some aspects of it must have been bad, or at least not consistent with their needs, or else they wouldn't be disgruntled. So they're interesting. Okay, so I changed my mind. Don't schedule time with disgruntled customers. How about we think of it as scheduling time with people who have selected your product or service, who care a lot about it, who want to give you some of their time to provide their thoughts, and who have had a mixture of good experiences and experiences that can identify opportunities for you to improve. Maybe that's a meeting I wouldn't be as apprehensive about. Maybe a meeting I could really look forward to, because I could potentially learn a lot from someone who has in common with me passionate feelings about my product or service. And I'll add one more thing that's great about disgruntled customers. They don't want to leave you. How do I know? Because if they did, they wouldn't be disgruntled customers. They'd be ex-customers. So even if there's, shall we say, a negative emotional content to their communications, you need to read between the lines of their anger, or whatever it is, and hear what they are really feeling, which is a desire for someone to satisfy their need. I have a 1-year-old at home, and he will scream and cry, but pop that bottle in his mouth, and he stops instantly and gives you a big smile and starts sucking. What a great feeling to be able to turn someone around like that. Now he loves me. So while you might not always be able to succeed, every meeting with a disgruntled customer is also an opportunity to take someone unhappy and make them happy. And that's a great feeling. In fact, that's a good segue into the next aspect of this I want to cover. There are really three types of unhappy customers, and it's helpful when dealing with one to determine which type you're talking to. The first type is the customer who should be happy. The second type is the customer who shouldn't be happy. And the third type is the customer who will never be happy. So what do we mean by all this? The customer who should be happy is one who signed up for your product or service for reasons that are consistent with the intent of your product or service, and is basically trying to use it for what it was intended for. If the customer represents your typical customer and still isn't happy, then you really want to understand what the problem is and how to fix it, because there's probably a bunch more people with similar dissatisfaction and who perhaps don't care enough to complain. See, your disgruntled customer is not your worst customer. Your worst customer is the one who doesn't care enough to complain. They just leave, and you never know why. And of course, whatever problem these customers who should be happy are dealing with may also be turning away some prospects that never even become your customers in the first place. Clearly, making these customers a priority to understand what it takes to make them happy is extremely important. Now, contrast that to the customer who shouldn't be happy. What does that mean? Well, that's the customer where something about how or what they are trying to use your product for really isn't aligned with what the product was designed for. If I sell oil paints meant to be used to create paintings, and the customer is trying to paint furniture with that paint and is unhappy with the results, they fall into the category we call those who shouldn't be happy. Now, it's easy to dismiss these customers and just say, well, they shouldn't have bought the product. Okay, maybe not, but they could also represent a massive new market opportunity. We'll talk in a bit about questions to ask disgruntled customers, but let's unpack this little example a bit more. Why on earth would a customer buy paint meant for painting pictures and use it to paint a chair? Are they a complete idiot? Well, we might come to learn that your paint comes in colors not available in traditional chair painting paints, or has a different kind of sheen, or has some other characteristic that made that customer want to try to use it for this off-label application. Although it didn't work in its current formulation, it might be a clue that there's a whole new market that, you never know, might even be larger than the market you are currently serving. We often call these types of users lead users, users who forge new ways to use your product that you would never consider. And even a failed lead user, like in our example, can seed ideas for product innovation. Similarly, if the problem with your product is that there are no instructions in Italian, or it's not compatible with Windows mobile phones, or it doesn't come in gluten-free form, or in size XXXL, or whatever the gap is that's causing the product not to work for this person who shouldn't be happy, it may be that by fixing that gap, you could open up a whole new market. Then the third category is those who will never be happy. Do any of you have a relative, perhaps, like this, who, no matter what happens, they are just never, ever, ever going to be happy? There's a great Geico commercial on right now where the little Australian lizard tells us that Geico has a 97% satisfaction rate. And then he says, and I'm not going to try to do an Australian accent, but he says, and the other 3%, well, there's no pleasing some people. Now, it's true that there are people out there who thrive emotionally on complaining. And you want to bear that in mind and not get too hung up on people like that. But also be careful about the tendency that some people have to quickly characterize people who aren't happy with you or your product as just being whiny complainers and putting the problem back on them. People like that exist, but it's a more useful mindset to assume that people who are complaining are doing so for a rational reason. After the fact, you can always filter out that small percentage who will truly never be happy. So for the most part, I have to disagree with the insurance reptile. Does he have a name? I don't know. Dismissing 3% of your customers as people who will never be happy is dangerous, because you might be missing a substantial market opportunity if some of those 3% are in the shouldn't be happy category. In fact, you might have 1% of dissatisfied customers in the shouldn't be happy category who could represent another 50% of potential customers if you solved their need and then marketed your product based on that different use case. And of course, some of the people you might tend to want to lump into this third never be happy category are really in category number 1, people who should and could be happy. But they might be just so emotional that they can be mistaken for people who are just complaining. For example, some people seem to emotionally exaggerate the impact of their dissatisfaction. Someone who tells you, I spent 30 minutes waiting in line at the rental car counter and it ruined my vacation. Now, that sounds a little crazy. But just because someone might not be reporting the emotional impact of their problem accurately or reasonably doesn't mean that they aren't cluing you in to real solvable problems. And in fact, you should be glad that this person tends to be a bit of a complainer, because a lot of other people might just have been unhappy, said nothing, and next time went to a competitor. Okay, have I convinced you? You're now going to fill your entire schedule with unhappy customers? Okay, great. Be sure to take a break for lunch in there somewhere. So in the second half of this video, I wanted to give you some tips on questions to ask disgruntled customers. I recommend you always start by asking who they are and what their goals were in buying your product. There are several benefits to this. First, people like to talk about themselves, so it tends to be a positive way to start the conversation. Second, it puts their mind back to a time they were happy with you when they decided to buy the product or service. And third, it helps you understand whether they are customer type number 1 or number 2, whether their expectations are aligned with the product's intent. I sometimes hear also asked pointedly why they selected your product. This helps you understand what they care about most, and also what you did right from a marketing and sales perspective to get this person to sign up in the first place. Now, before too long, you have to ask, what's the problem? Because they're dying to get that off their chest. The trick here is to let them blow off some steam if they have to, but then try to unpack the problem to be sure it's really clear. For example, if the person says, I can't believe how sucky your restaurant is. It just blows. Well, this isn't very actionable feedback. Or sometimes a customer wants to tell a long, convoluted story about what happened to them. It might be useful to hear the story, or it might be necessary in order to make them feel heard. But in the end, you need to listen and probe for one key thing that is almost always the root cause for dissatisfaction. Where did this person's expectations fail to be fulfilled? Very often, they want to tell you what happened, and it's important to understand that, but also ask questions to understand what they expected to happen. Now, sometimes it might sound counterintuitive to ask that if the outcome is really terrible. For example, take our chair painting example. If the person tried painting the chair with oil paints, meant for portraits, and 3 days later the chair was still not dry and the paint was dripping off, it's pretty ridiculous to say, is that not what you expected? Obviously, that's not what they expected. But what did they expect? How fast did they expect it to dry? How long did they expect it to last, etc.? Asking these questions get to the root of what the person was really looking for and will further help you determine if they are type 1 or type 2 customer. In which cases also were the gaps in expectations also your gaps in expectation in terms of how your operation is supposed to perform? You're probably not supposed to leave people in line for 30 minutes at the rental car counter. And then in which cases are the gaps that they perceive actually gaps between their expectations and really what your fundamental offering is? I'm going to give you another Tony Robbins formula here, which this thinking really comes from. Satisfaction equals reality minus expectations. So if the reality is better than the expectation, you have a satisfied customer. If it's less, dissatisfied. Pretty simple, intuitive, right? Well, one thing this formula teaches us, though, is that reality isn't the only place we can improve satisfaction. We can also improve in terms of the expectations we set. So try to probe on where their expectations came from in the first place. If the expectations were misset compared to your actual offering, Did something in your marketing or sales process create that expectation? It's common to see online complaints that the salesperson at Best Buy told me this PC would be compatible with my printer, but it wasn't. This computer sucks. If your distribution chain is making mistakes representing what your product can do, this is a problem you may need to correct. Likewise, your call center, brochures, website, etc. Also, it can be helpful to ask what impact the price of your product had on the person's expectations. Sometimes people assume a product at a certain price point will have certain characteristics, even if it's not true or represented that way. Okay, a few more questions that can be valuable to ask. If the person is still using your product, ask why. Why haven't they just switched to another product or service? Now, don't ask this like you want them to switch to another product, but you might learn something interesting about your product from this question. Someone might say, well, I hate the taste of your product, but I stay with it because it's the only gluten-free protein powder available in California. You may have differentiating aspects of your product that you don't even realize that are keeping your unhappy customers chained to you. Good information to have. Okay, the last question we'll focus on is also a good way to end conversations with disgruntled customers, and is a question to ask both yourself and the customer. How can we fix this for you? A lot of the reason we want to talk to disgruntled customers is because of what we can learn to improve our overall business, more than about saving that one individual customer. However, if we can save the individual customer, this is also very positive. And studies have shown that a customer who has a major point of dissatisfaction, who complains and is able to get that issue resolved, and who really feels heard and understood as well, will often become a far more loyal customer than the one who never had a problem in the first place. So there's another great thing about disgruntled customers. They're offering you an opportunity to transform them into your most loyal customers. Wow, these disgruntled customers are awesome. Naturally, depending on the nature of the problem, your ability to truly resolve what this customer is seeking is going to vary. Remember though, sometimes just being heard is enough to satisfy a customer. They may be able to live with the problem itself, especially if it's in the past, like a bad customer service experience, if they just feel validated and heard. Sometimes it's enough to just say, the experience you had is not what we want our customers to experience. It's not what we plan for or train our people to deliver. It was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I appreciate that you took the time to let us know about it. A message like that comes from the heart, not read from a script, can be worth more than discounts or free gifts. A follow-up email or letter reiterating your thanks for that customer's feedback can further reinforce this. Of course, if the customer is experiencing an acute problem, like a broken product, then clearly you want to address that, if at all possible. Let the customer know you are committed to solving the problem, what steps you plan to take, and how you will keep them apprised of the progress, and ideally have one owner of problem resolution for this customer and make sure that they are accountable for it. And lastly, if the customer is a type 2, what it is that they want is just not something your product or service can provide them, at least at that point in time. One way of thanking the customer for their feedback is to try to advise them on how to be successful in their underlying goal, even if that means recommending a competing product or service. Across the many, many companies we've worked with, we generally observe that companies that do the right thing for customers see the benefits in the long run. Okay, hopefully I've met your expectations with this video and encouraged you to embrace disgruntled customers and given you some tools for how to do that. If so, I'd love to hear from you about how you are using this content in your organization. We'd love your feedback on any of our social media touchpoints, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, LinkedIn, or any of the others. And you can always email us at info@movinginteractive.com. And of course, if I haven't met your expectations today, then I'd really love to hear from you and learn where we missed the mark. Thanks for watching this episode of our Digital Innovation Series. Plenty more episodes on our website, movinginteractive.com. I think we've got over 10 of them at this point. I encourage you to check those out. And as always, I wish you tremendous success in all your digital innovation.